Hello, my little dog pounds of a feather. So today, in the last lecture, we talked about the endocrine system, and we looked at how the endocrine system can function as an integrator. And it does so with chemical messages that are dumped into the blood that act on distant targets. And those chemical messages are hormones. So today, we're going to start looking at the nervous system and how the nervous system can act as an integrator. And the very first thing we need to deal with is the fact, remind ourselves that the first half of the nervous system's mechanism for communication involves the action potential. So the entire lecture today is to prep us for dealing with the action potential. We know that the action potential is an electrical signal that ultimately results in a chemical signal being released upon an effector, and that happens at the synapse. And we'll deal with that aspect of neural communication in the next lecture. So remind yourself, probably when you think of the nervous system, you think of neurons. And if you've taken anatomy, then you know that, you know what, neurons aren't the only player in the show. And in fact, a dead white guy named Camillo Golgi, fantastic, information found on the internet about Camillo when he was born, fantastic. When he won his Nobel Prize, probably for, this guy, his name is Golgi, dog pound, so you can guess that a bunch of his research dealt with the Golgi apparatus. But apparently back in the day, he dropped a brain into silver nitrate, and it stained all crazy colors, and he realized that neurons were only 10% of brain tissue, and the other 90% was made up of these glial cells. So he's kind of famous. I think it's fascinating and very important that they tell us that he was white, and thank goodness also straight. Seriously? Like, these things kill me, and it really is out there. Like, this is important that we know these things. We do know that back in the day, it was rather challenging for people of multiple colors of skin and people without penises to get involved in the studies of science. And we know that now that barrier is definitely being broken down, which is really good. I always find these things entertaining. So let's go see what Camillo actually discovered. And if you have had anatomy, then you know that, dude, we have multiple kinds of cells in the nervous system. And this one right here, this big yellow one, is that yellow? That's the neuron. And in the next section, we're going to draw a picture of it. We also have these little, like, immune cells called microglia. These are actually macrophages that are found in the cell. We have these guys that look like they're holding on to the axon of the neuron, and we're going to do neural anatomy in a second, but these guys are called oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes. And the oligodendrocytes make myelin sheaths surrounding neuron axons, and we'll look at those guys in a second. And then we have these guys here. These are your astrocytes. Astrocytes play a role in the blood-brain barrier. You can see that the astrocyte has hands touching the neurons, so they're helping kind of clean the neurons, and there's evidence that they actually play a role in mediating communication between the neurons, deciding like what is a viable message and what isn't. But then you can see they also have their hands on the capillaries in the brain. And this creates this blood-brain barrier where you have the capillary layer, the epithelium of the capillary, and then you have this other layer from the astrocytes, and that produces two layers of thickness more, double what you would normally have to pass through if you were something that wanted to exit the capillaries in the rest of your body. But in the brain, you've got twice as much to get through. And then, of course, you've got these little guys. Don't they look like some sort of epithelial cell? These are your ependymal cells. And the ependymal cells have cilia, and they produce cerebrospinal fluid, and they help circulate that cerebrospinal fluid throughout your nervous system. So 90% of your cells are all these other ones, and only 10% are neurons. All these other cells are very important for neural function, but the action potential itself, we're going to look at that. First of all, we're going to look at the neuron's anatomy, and then we're going to look at how the neuron communicates electrically. Be right back. Let's draw ourselves a picture of a neuron. And here's the scoop, you guys. I'm going to try, I don't know, this is totally what a neuron actually looks like. Just kidding. This is the cell body of the neuron, and here's my cell nucleus. And then you can see that we have a whole bunch of extensions, and I'm just going to make one little, okay, draw it like that, and then we'll label our parts. Can you imagine that these little, whatever those are, like hairy, whatever those things, like sunbeams that are coming out of my neuron, those are called dendrites. And dendrites are defined by the information direction that information travels. So dendrites receive information from the environment or from another cell and take it toward the nucleus or toward the cell body. This is my cell body. It's also called the soma, and you might see that as you are doing research for other things, so it's nice to know that. There's a place on the axon called, there's a place on the neuron called the axon hillock. Axon hillock. And that's the place where the cell body meets the next structure, which is the axon. I often, when I draw neurons, I often will just draw the axon as a line, and I'm not doing that today because I want to make sure that you recognize that this is actually, there's cytoplasm inside this thing. It's a cell. It's just a super long and interesting cell. The axon, information is going to travel away from the cell body in the axon, and it travels down to something called a synaptic knob. I'm running out of colors. How can I run out of colors? I've got like every color on the planet available to me. This is called a synaptic knob or an axon terminal or a bouton, because that means button in French. And then you have an effector. So I'm just going to make my effector like a box, and we'll write effector. And the space, this is important because I think sometimes people, I don't know what people think, but this space is the synapse. So this is the space we must cross, and electricity cannot cross this space. So this is where chemical neurotransmitters are dumped, and the neurotransmitters will cross the space and hook up to a receptor on the effector. So we're going to spend the majority of the day talking about the electricity or the message that gets sent down. Okay, you can't see that at all. I can't see it at all. But the electrical message that gets sent to the synaptic knob, and then tomorrow we'll talk about the chemical message that gets released into the synapse and passes the message on. Before we do anything else, we have to know, dude, I keep talking about this whole concept of an electrical message, but what is electricity? So let's spend some time actually talking about a definition of electricity. Okay, this blows my brain apart because electricity, all it is, truly, electricity is nothing more than moving charged particles. That's it. So when there's electricity that runs through the wires to your light and then lights up your light, all that is moving charged particles. And the particles that are moving through the wire in your light bulb are electrons. And we know electrons are negatively charged, and so if electrons are streaming along a wire, that's electricity. Now, there is a huge part of my brain that is like, they can't quite conceptualize what that is. I can totally give you the definition all day long. And I can totally visualize how if those charged particles are moving through a really, really thin wire where there's not much room, but there's a big pressure to push those charged particles through that really thin wire, I can totally visualize how that wire will glow. It'll release heat and light, and because those particles are like creating friction or whatever, I can totally visualize that. But still, there's like this abstract quality to the concept of electricity that I think is difficult, especially when you start thinking, okay, a neuron is not going to light up. But if somehow we can set up a situation where charged particles will move along the axon and the dendrites down to the axon terminal or the synaptic knobs, if we could get charged particles to move somehow through this space, then we could create an electrical message. And guess what? That's all an action potential is. It's this wave of charged particles moving down the neuron parts. Now, how do we say, okay, so if we're going to get that to happen, somehow we have to set up a difference in charge from the inside of the neuron to the outside of the neuron. So somehow we have to say, okay, you know what? We're going to make the inside of the neuron super negative, negatively charged. Compared to the outside, we're going to make it positive. And if, okay, so take a deep breath and imagine that if you could do that, if you could set up a difference in charge from the inside to the outside of a neuron, then you could actually make it so, let's say, a positively charged particle like, just for the heck of it, sodium, might want to move into the cell. That's a moving charged particle. Done. You just created electricity. Seriously? That's really the end game. If you can change, if you can create a difference in charge and then control the moment when charged particles can move, you can create electricity. And then if you can make it like move like a wave down the axon, boom, you just created an action potential. So how do we do that? How do we set up a more negative inside and a more positive outside of our neuron? And that, hopefully already you're like, oh, I think I can visualize how I might be able to do that, because we actually saw a pump, a transporter, an active transporter in lecture number, I think it was 3, that gives you a huge hint. So you go look that up, and I'll come back and we'll talk about it.